Welcome back to special video edition of Backlog Books. My name is Cara. In this video, I will be reading the second chapter of An Irresistible Impulse by Billie Douglass, which was sent to me in place of a George Takei autobiography because the internet is a cruel place. I probably recommend, watching the first one so you know what's happening, but I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. Do whatever you want. I am going to look at how long chapter 2 is, because maybe I'll decide not to do it. Oh my god. Ugh! Maybe I won't read all of chapter 2. Look at how many pages that is. Jesus. So it's 25 pages? Fine. I wonder how many chapters there are. Do you have an index? No. How many pages are there? I'm just trying to look without seeing. Oh god. Oh no! There are 252 pages and about 10 chapters. So some of these chapters are going to be longer than others. Maybe some of these will end up being 2-part videos. Anyway, we left off last time with Abby, our main character, who has been selected for jury duty and taken to sequestration with the other jurors. She made significant eye contact with a dude in the jury selection room, and so she's really hoping he's gonna come back and be her man now. She is currently dating her boss, whose name is Sean, who she says she really cares about, but also she doesn't like and doesn't want to talk to because he's kind of been controlling. He has not appeared on page. He's only phoned in, and we were not impressed. Okay. Chapter 2. Also, I do voices. I think I might even remember the voices I did. Okay, so we left off last time. The dude Abby made significant eye contact with has been chosen to also be a juror. He was right behind her. She caught her breath and closed her eyes. Abby dared to hope in that instant that she might be right. Then, tempering enthusiasm with caution, she slowly turned. Chapter 2. At close range, he was much taller than Abby would have imagined, but he looked every bit as exciting as he had that morning. He was wearing khakis. Just khaki. And a blazer with elbow patches. So, as if she'd feared the loss of his humor with his selection as a juror, she was quickly heartened by the vibrant sparkle of his eyes. "Hi," she offered more breathlessly than she'd intended. My breathy voice for Abby has been on point per the author just now. "I wasn't sure you'd made it." "Nor I you," he countered in quiet confidence. "Believe me, it's a relief." He cast a glance past her shoulder into the room. "I'm not sure about these others." Abby's gaze joined his, her voice as low. "I know. Not too encouraging, is it?" We're already starting off with dunking on these people you have known for 30 seconds. "To say the least, it's obvious they'd rather be anywhere but here." "Oh, and you guys really want to be here?" "Not you?" she asked, turning to look pertly up at him. "Mm-hmm." His grin bore a hint of that air of conspiracy she'd heard in his voice moments earlier. "No more so than you." His cocked brow... My eyebrow raised high enough. His cocked brow seemed to invite her elaboration, but she wasn't quite ready to accept the invitation. That was a fun alliteration. It's not really an alliteration. It's just sort of a rhyme. Because on this page, elaboration and invitation are right above each other. You can't see that. It doesn't matter. "Listen, honey, you want to jump his bones and he's here. Let's go." Rather, she looked back toward the group, which stood in awkward clusters around the room. Oh, this is the cocktail party. I forgot it wasn't lunch anymore. "It's a hardship for many of them, I guess." Not enough to be excused. No, but still, in their minds, it may be an ordeal. Not in yours, he reversed the questioning. She had no choice but to follow suit. No more so than in yours. She grinned, feeling suddenly and surprisingly happy. I'm Abby Barnes. A large hand was extended her way. Ben Wyeth here. Okay. In the first chapter, somebody introduced himself by saying, "It's Tom Herrick." Who would... So to have him introduce himself as Ben Wyeth here, like he's a radio announcer or something, amazing. It's my pleasure. In fact, the pleasure was hers. For his hand was warm and encompassing, his fingers confident in their grasp. And his smile, ... His smile did something very delightful to her insides. She could only nod more shyly and wait until he released her and spoke again. Honey, it's okay to want to jump his bones. You don't have to be shy about it. You don't seem at all disturbed at the idea of being locked away for 3 weeks, he began directly. Why not? And don't tell me it's your duty. Abby laughed knowingly. You've heard that one today, too? More than once, he drawled, then grew more serious. But tell me your reasons. Nosy. Of the many she'd analyzed in the course of the day, she chose the least personal and shrugged at its simplicity. What? Oh, her reasons that she had analyzed in the course of the day. She chose the least personal and shrugged at its simplicity. It's an exciting opportunity, something new and different, not to mention important. She blushed. But even that sounds pompous. Perhaps, Ben acknowledged, but I agree with you. This case will be a controversial one. To serve on its jury has to be a challenge. A sudden thought returned Abby's attention to those in the room. Is it complete? The jury? I was number 12. I'm 13. Bad omen? To the contrary, she mused, but gave a shrug of coy innocence. She is putting this on. Good for her. Get that man. Who knows? And number 14? Ben put his hands on his shoulders and turned her to the right. Don't manhandle someone you just met. Ugh. Then he leaned forward, his mouth close by her ear again. That's too cozy. You just met. There, the gentleman in the green jacket. Her eye easily found its target. Oh dear, how could I have missed him? I've never seen a blazer quite that shade before, she reflected diplomatically. It's called Wake Up Green. Charming, isn't it? He quipped. Absolutely. It had to be the loudest thing she'd ever laid eyes on. Reading her mind, Ben straightened. Reading her mind? Listen, I was like, if this turns into a murder mystery a la Agatha Christie, where Abby turns into the murder, I'm totally for it. If this turns into, like, a psychic vampire situation, I am not for it. Just for the record. I think I could use a drink. Come on, let's go in. The hesitancy Abby had felt when she'd first arrived downstairs seemed to have vanished. Taking confidence from Ben, she let him guide her between watchful groups of 2s, 3s, and 4s toward the bar at the far end of the room. Bourbon and water, she prompted the bartender. All right. Ben ordered his straight, then turned to study the jurors silently. Jurors. I just keep thinking about that 30 Rock episode where the joke was the rural juror. Huh. Abby studied him. His profile had a chiseled quality about it, his features strong, not quite perfect. His hair had a natural wave with lighter streaks woven through cocoa to hint where one day there might be gray to match his eyes. Okay. With lighter streaks woven through cocoa to hint Tonight he wore tan slacks and a brown tweed blazer, very intriguing, with a crisp white shirt which played up the last of the summer's tan. "Here you go, folks." The bartender handed them their drinks. Abby accepted hers gracefully before following Ben's direction to a nearby window seat. "What do you do in real life?" he asked, safely installing her in a corner of the bay and sliding down within arm's reach. "He's got her cornered!" "No!" "Real life," she chuckled. "I like that." Then she spoke more quietly. "I'm a nurse." "A hospital-type nurse?" "An office-type nurse. I work with a pediatric practice." "Nurse practitioner?" Her eyes brightened. "You've heard the term?" It was Ben's turn to chuckle. "I have a close friend who's a pediatrician." "I bet it's Sean!" "Sorry." He swears by his nurse practitioners, depends on them to handle the less serious problems while he tackles the major ones. He's the first to sing their praises." "Thank heavens for that," Abby exclaimed. "We need all the help we can get when it comes to our image." "Really?" I feel like nurses are pretty widely, competent and well thought of. Okay. "You mean your doctors don't appreciate you?" Abby's cheeks flamed as a picture of Sean flashed through her mind. "Oh, they do. In the bedroom." I'm sorry, that's not in this. That's not in this book. "And our patients do too. But other people, well, it seems that I'm constantly having to explain that my job is different from that of a bedpan lady." Bedpan lady has a very important role in society. She thought back to the morning's explanation. "Come to think of it, the judge was more solicitous than most. After I described my responsibilities as falling midway between those of a traditional nurse and a doctor, he wanted to be sure I could be spared." "And you can?" "I'm here, aren't I?" she rejoined with a smile, looking up to find herself drawn into her gaze. It seemed a fine place to be lost just then. "I'll drink to that," he declared, as though sensing her thoughts again. "Don't do this to me." Abby joined him, sipping her drink absently. "But what about you?" she asked at last. "What do you do for a living?" "I teach." Her eyes widened. "Do you really?" "Uh-huh." His lips twitched just enough to suggest that there was more to the story. She bit readily. "Children-type teach?" she asked, borrowing his style, imagining him propped on a desk before 37-year-olds. Despite the look of indulgence on his face, he crushed that image summarily. "Young adult-type teach." "College level?" Why can't you just say what you do like a normal person? Just say, "I'm a professor at the local college," instead of, "I teach." "That's right, I'm on the faculty at—" Feigning caution, he lowered his voice. At the college across the river." Loving his theatrics, Abby beamed. "You teach at Dart—" "Shh! More than once I've been accused of treason." He glanced furtively at the others, "Okay? And I don't particularly care to alienate these good citizens so early on in our association." Unconsciously, she'd lowered her voice to match his. "But it's an Ivy League school," she argued. "They should be proud of your association with it, regardless of whether it's in New Hampshire or Vermont. And besides, it's less than 30 minutes away." I have to look at the map again, excuse me. "Well, New Hampshire's on this map, but is not. Wherever the heck Dartmoor is not on this map. I assume it's Dartmoor. I don't know maps. I don't know colleges. Also, I guess he lives in Vermont but works in New Hampshire, therefore is called to jury duty in Vermont. That's how that works, probably. "Less than 30 minutes away." "Make that 15 from where I live. And you're right, it's a fine school. But still," he sighed, "it's not in Vermont. These people have a unique sense of loyalty." She shot a glance toward the citizens in question. It seemed none had moved beyond a shuffle to the right or the left. Her voice remained low. In this case, I'd say it was martyrdom. Why do they look so disgruntled? Maybe because you're going to be on like a kidnapping case and they're sad that they have to sleep in beds that aren't their own for 3 weeks. Ben, too, noted the predominance of sober faces. A drink in hand had done nothing to relax them. They're not used to change, I guess, he remarked thoughtfully. You have to admit that living up here is much more placid than life in the big city. We've both been there. Puzzled, Abby frowned and looked slowly sideways. How did you know? How did you know? When he looked back at her, he seemed startled, as though unaware at first of the assumption he'd made. His own brow furrowed beneath its casual thatch of hair. Bourbon and water, I guess. It came so naturally to you. She nodded, smiling her guilt. That'll do it every time. Not that I drink often, mind you, but a fellow I dated through college had this thing for bourbon. I guess I developed a taste for it out of necessity. Is bourbon and water a thing in the big city? How about the guy? Taste gone bad? A long time ago, she drawled without regret, amazed at the extent of her own relaxation. Benjamin Wyeth was an easy person to open to. Benjamin Wyeth, saying his full name, albeit silently for the first time, struck a familiar chord. She couldn't quite place it. Who is he? Have you ever... Oh, I'm so sorry, this is him. Have you ever married? He asked gently, momentarily diverting her attention. No. How about you? For the first time, he seemed to withdraw into himself. Oh no, a dark had passed. His eyes darkened fleetingly, his brows drew together, his voice took on a distant quality when he spoke. I was married once, a long time ago. My wife died. I'm sorry, Ben. Reacting on instinct, Abby reached to put her hand on his arm. It must have been very painful. As quickly as he'd gone, he'd returned to her, his eyes softer now, searching. It was. It still is sometimes. We were young and idealistic. She died in a fluke accident. I suppose half the pain was disillusionment, you know. He forced a grin. The it can happen to anyone else but us type of thing. Did you murder your wife? Did Sean murder your wife? Is your wife still alive? Seems unlikely. This is his dark, tragic past. Like serving on a sequestered jury? She asked softly, intent only on making him forget the past. He nodded and smiled more naturally, like serving on a sequestered jury. Then he tipped his head to the side in pensive query. Do you live alone? This is getting creepy. Startled by the shift, she simply nodded. Do you mind it? She gave herself a minute to gather her thoughts. No, I kind of like it. I've always had roommates for one reason or another until now. Even after 3 years, it's still a novelty. Besides, there are friends and neighbors to keep me from getting lonely. At work, there was Janet and even Sean when he wasn't harping on the state of his heart. In her South Woodstock neighborhood, there were the Alexanders, Cindy and Jay, who had opened their home, their hearts, and their minds to her when she first moved north from New York. Then there were people like Marta, whose hand-woven shawls had become the thing with which to warm one's shoulders on a chilly Vermont night. And Ted, whose knowledge of Bach ran a close second to his expertise on the winter slopes. And Andre, in whose bookstore she'd spent many a Saturday afternoon and whose literary recommendations had brought her that many more Sunday afternoons of pleasure. I think Ted and Andre live together and are gay. I love that for them. I'm so sorry. You've never wanted to live with a man? Just like a man, not like with a romantic partner or like a husband, just like a man. Just want to live with a man. momentarily taken aback by the more personal turn of the conversation. This has all been pretty personal, honey. You talking about married and living places, and admittedly, you've never wanted to live with a man is very much more personal. Abby took time to find the right words. She does this a lot. I don't know if you noticed. This is at least the third time in 36 pages she has given herself some time to consider what she wants to say. Wow, what would that be like? There was nothing to be defensive about. She knew her mind where the opposite sex was concerned. No, she said gently. Good for her. I've never wanted to do that. And it hasn't simply been a matter of principle. Oh, this is like a live with someone you're not married with thing. Maybe? I've never found anyone I care to spend 24 hours a day with. She hesitated for a second. I suppose it would be nice, with the right man. Her lips thinned as she thought of Sean. What was wrong with their relationship? Why couldn't she get excited about him? 'Cause he sucks, hun. Aha! There is someone, Ben teased. I can see it in your eyes. As she shook her head, her hair waved darkly by her shoulders. No, there's no one. I mean, there is someone, though. Like, you haven't actually broken up with him? So you do technically have a romantic partner. It was, in a way, the truth. No, it wasn't. Far from convinced, her companion shifted on the window seat to stare at her thoughtfully. It's strange, ... What is? Your reaction to being here. His gaze narrowed, and Abby felt suddenly self-conscious. The voice that went on was deep and intense, surprisingly so for a man she'd taken to be easygoing. You're looking forward to this just as I am. I could tell that the minute I saw you this morning. In that sense, we're different from the others. You and I. Blech. He paused to study her closely. You live alone, so it's not a roommate you're trying to escape. And you have a job, a good job that interests you. So it's not as if you're dying for a vacation. Am I right so far? What is it with, like, meet cutes in books where the guy has to, like, psychoanalyze the girl? I'm reading another book where it does the exact same thing. In a much worse way, to be clear. Uh-huh, she replied, intrigued by the analytic nature of his mind. Oh, that's just what his brain is like? Okay. He seemed to be solving a riddle and enjoying every clue. You're not a riddle, babe. You're a person. Now, this business about a man. You're attractive, intelligent, and single. And you have to have known that this wouldn't be a swinging time. So I asked myself why a woman like you would welcome an experience like this. I've already given you a reason. One, he reminded her with a teasing smile, but I have this nagging feeling that there's another. You get a certain look in your eye every so often. You've known each other for 2 minutes. Is it relief? I'd almost suspect that these 3 weeks are a kind of reprieve for you. He paused. Now you're blushing. Am I close? How dare you bring up that she's blushing? It's the worst. It's the bourbon, she argued, trying to stifle a grin. What did you say you taught? It had to be psychology. It's not the bourbon, he went on, clearly enjoying the banter. Oh, boy. You've still got the better half of that drink in its glass. Maybe she's a lightweight. I didn't say what I taught. But it's political science. Oh, no! No kidding. That's a great field. Any specialty? You're trying to change the subject. I thought we were talking about each other. No, Abby. I was talking about you. Excuse me, Dr. Wyeth, Miss Barnes. Both heads flew up to find the bartender standing before them looking decidedly awkward. I wonder how long that bartender has been standing there trying to get their attention. If you'd like to bring your drinks into the other room, I believe Mrs. Abbott has dinner ready. Ben was smoothly on his feet, his hand at Abby's elbow, drawing her up. Stop touching her. Thank you. I'm afraid we were. He cleared his throat conspicuously, then looked back at Abby, wrapped up in ourselves. It was only when the bartender turned to walk away that Abby realized the room was quiet and empty. "How embarrassing," she whispered, blushing more furiously. "I hadn't even noticed they'd gone." "That's because they're such a captivating group," he quipped. I hate this. Quipped should not be a dialogue tag. It just shouldn't. Don't do it. Don't. Look at me. Don't do it. "I don't know," she mused. "Maybe we're not being fair. After all, this is only the first night. We haven't given them much of a chance." "You're right, hun." They'd reached the lobby and crossed through. At the entrance to the dining room, Ben spoke more quietly. "Maybe you're right. Perhaps we ought to separate during dinner and concentrate on getting to know the others." But Abby suddenly realized she'd been looking forward to having dinner with him. "On the other hand," she hedged, lowering her voice to a stage whisper as they neared the table, "I don't see that there's any rush. There'll be plenty of time." The thought was suspended in favor of a sheepish grin when three faces turned to regard her questioningly. Ben had made up his mind, she mused, and that evidently was that. There was nothing for her to do but accept disappointment graciously. "May I join you?" she asked softly, aware that her escort had already pulled out the only free chair for her. Three quiet nods met her inquiry. Dutifully, she sat down. I feel like that was a weird transition, but okay. Also, I'm tired. It's almost my bedtime, so I'm going to take a break, and I'll come back to this whenever I have a chance. Who knows? That was only like 10 pages. It was exactly 10 pages. Okay. We'll leave the other 15 for another time. We'll see how far we get this time. Okay, I think we stopped on page 39 after she sat down for dinner with people she doesn't think are interesting. Okay. All things considered, it could have been worse. The food was superb, a soul almondine. It's been one sentence and I need to Google something. Hold on. I feel like I probably could have guessed this. It's a garnish of almonds. Okay. The food was superb, a sole almondine that Abby found to be as good as any served in the finest restaurants at which she'd eaten. I'm sorry, were you just served an almond garnish? I mean, I love almonds. Don't get me wrong. Just seems like not enough food. Vegetables and bread were fresh, and the chocolate truffle cake for dessert was more than she'd bargained for. Her quip about needing that exercise after all, though, went over like a lead balloon. Wouldn't you want to say went down like a lead balloon? I guess, yeah, sure. I want it to be down like a lead balloon because that's a line from Good Omens. So, I'm just thinking about other books. It wasn't that there was a hostility, but rather a pervasive wariness that inhibited conversation as nothing else might have done. While the upcoming trial must have weighed heavily on every mind there, no one dared to discuss it for fear of violating the directive given earlier. Nor was there significant talk of a personal nature, much as Abby tried to initiate it. She would have been interested to learn more about these people, their homes, their jobs, their families, but with each question came a simple and usually dead-ended response. Dead-ended response, offered in a tone that discouraged further inquiry. Had Abby not known better, she would have sworn the three had agreed upon a code whereby each chose to suffer in private. Is this what it's like to be an extrovert? Like you just really want to talk to people all the time? Acceptable topics of conversation, on the other hand, were the outlook for the winter's ski touring season, the oppressive price of home heating oil, and the ever-changing status of the American League pennant race. Is that a boat thing? I'm gonna Google it. It's a baseball thing? Oh, I do not understand this. I should not have clicked on this link. Okay, it's baseball. It's a baseball thing. Okay. It wasn't that Abby was bored. It kind of sounds like you are bored, babe. She could easily chat along with the rest on these subjects. But there was something deeper at stake here, and her mind began to wander. What would happen as the trial progressed? If the jurors were uncomfortable with each other as a group, how would they cope with the pressure that was bound to mount? Bound to mount. Hours of intense concentration, days of sitting in the same chair, listening to point after point of evidence, hearing first one side, then the other, with innumerable objections overruled and sustained, scattered about. For the first time, Abby felt truly apprehensive. Well, I guess at least you're thinking about it. It was one thing to view the proceedings as a unique experience, quite another to acknowledge that the experience was apt to be grueling. 3 weeks of service was a very long time. I mean, not really. It's less than a month. Also, I cannot believe that it's only going to be 3 weeks for this court case and that you already know it's only going to be 3 weeks. Maybe it'll be a plot point later that it's actually way longer. Is there a limit on how long a jury trial will go? I'm going to Google that too. I'm so sorry that this whole book is just me Googling things. Apparently, yes, judges can choose to limit how long a jury trial will last. I think that's what that one page I read on the internet meant. Anyway, would she hold up through it all? There was, of course, one bright light on the horizon. Oh my God. He sat 2 tables to the left and was flanked by the court officer named Ray, one other gentleman Abby hadn't yet met, and Patricia, lucky Patricia, who seemed positively taken with Ben if her rapt expression was an accurate index of enthusiasm. As a matter of pride, Abby refused to look for Ben's reaction. It was enough that she envied Patricia the company. Nonetheless, she couldn't help but feel let down when he disappeared shortly after coffee was served. To her surprise, it was Patricia who moved to join her for a second cup when the others excused themselves as well. Listen, I've been making faces about this because Abby saw Patricia and was like, ooh, that's the person closest to my age who's the most attractive in this room. I don't think they're going to turn out to be lesbians like Grace and Louise obviously are, but I can hope. I missed you this afternoon, the younger woman bubbled quickly. Oh, no. Okay. The younger woman bubbled quickly as she put her coffee cup down and slid into the free chair next to Abby. I was hoping to catch you at some point. It's Abby, isn't it? Abby smiled, petty jealousies quickly forgotten. Good for you. After the hour she'd just been through, a breath of fresh air had just wafted into the room. That's right. Patricia? Patsy, the other nodded. Did they get you home for everything you needed? Oh, yes. Lorraine supervised it all. It was an odd experience. I know, but you're lucky. I was sworn in yesterday, and the waiting's been awful. At least today brought you and Ben. Her eyes lit up. He's something else. I saw you with him before dinner and didn't want to bother you. You both seemed totally occupied with each other. Say, you're not attached or anything, are you? Could be lesbians, that's all I'm saying. To Ben, Abby protested, suddenly cautious. I just met him today. No, I mean, otherwise. You're not married? Please, just once could it be surprise lesbians? When Abby shook her head, Patsy raced on eagerly. Grab him, he's gorgeous. Patsy, please. Patsy, no, I'm serious. You make a great-looking couple. This is a jury. He's brilliant, she went on, as though Abby had never spoken. Do you know that he's a college professor? He didn't say where and all that, and I had to all but pry that much out of him. But you should have heard the discussion he had with Bernie about the caste system in India. Oh, boy. Ooh. What kind of discussion, though? That could go a number of different directions. Does he ever have facts at his fingertips? Oh, he's pre-Google. Abby had no doubt about that. It sounds like your dinner was a little more interesting than mine. Who's Bernie? Barely stopping for breath, Patsy was fast proving herself to be the antithesis of the other jurors. Bernie is Bernie Langenbach. He was the first juror sworn in. Poor guy's been here since the day before yesterday. He owns a restaurant in White River Junction. How about you, Patsy? What do you do? For the first time, the blonde-haired woman spoke slowly, but it was only pride that weighted her words. I work for the Eastern Appalachian Company designing ski wear. You design it? That's fantastic. Patsy nodded. I enjoy the work. Then she grew more mischievous, and it gives me an excuse to stay near the slopes. Something in her eyes told Abby that her interest wasn't purely in shussing. Is that a ski thing? Shussing. I'm gonna Google it. Oh, it's make a straight downhill run on skis. It's shoes. I think it's shoesing. Shoesing. Okay, Abby grinned, liking Patsy more by the minute. Let's have it. Who is he? Ugh. Really? Smiling gaily. It's the 80s. I know that's not what that means. Patsy leaned closer. He's a ski bum. I can't imagine starting like I'm going to tell you about this hot guy I like with, he's a ski bum. Maybe the 80s were a different time. And he's the most wonderful guy in the world. I mean, he's smart and funny, and is he ever a good looker? But can he ski? Abby asked, holding her expression sober only until her friend laughed aloud. Oh, they're friends now. That didn't take long, but good for them. Can he ski? She rolled her eyes heavenward. When he comes down that mountain, it is something to behold. She breathed in near reverence. Then, in an instant, she started up again. Boy, was he annoyed when he found out I couldn't talk with him. Now the story sounded familiar. He doesn't like talking through an interpreter, Abby asked, tongue-in-cheek. Not a bit. Patsy loudly sucked in her breath and let it out with similar gusto. And do I love that possessiveness. Blech. No, don't. That's gross. It's gross. Abby dissolved into gentle laughter. You're amazing, Patsy. A change from the very staid folks I ate with tonight. Sitting back in her chair, Patsy grimaced. You mean Dean didn't thrill you with his opinion of the economy? Uh-oh, you've heard it too? It was slightly conservative at best. Savage. Twice now, and Richard, he usually picks up with his plug for tourism. You know, it's a good thing that the rich are getting richer so they can afford to ski in these mountains. I hope you didn't try to argue with him, she added her warning, but it came too late. As a matter of fact, Abby moaned, I did suggest something about all those other people who might like to ski. And he clammed up, not another word. Patsy nodded. That seems to be the pattern. It's as though they're frightened of discussion. Not your Ben, though. He's not my Ben, Patsy. For all I know, he's got some little co-ed stowed in his cozy condominium. That seems unnecessarily derogative towards college students. Which I'm assuming is what she means by a co-ed. Oh, this is not her. Okay, excuse me. All he'd said was that he'd been married once. He'd never ruled out a current lover. "And besides, I've got my own hands full just now." "You do?" Patsy gleamed. "Tell me about him." But before Abby was able to say a word, Nicholas Abbott approached. "Abby, you've got a phone call." Nicholas Abbott is the owner of this hotel that they're sequestered in. I forgot that for a hot second. "Abby, you've got a phone call. It's your fiancé." "My fiancé? Who else? But I can't talk, can I?" "Grace is just finishing up with another call. She said she'd be glad to help you out." Not quite sure if she wanted to be helped out, particularly given her annoyance at Sean's audacity. They were not previously engaged before this point, I believe. She hesitated. "He says it's important," Nicholas added apologetically. Sighing, she nodded. There was always that chance that Sean did have a question relating to the work she'd be missing during the next few weeks. Girl, break up with him. She'd hardly given a thought to that with the events of the day, and she felt suddenly guilty. "Thank you, Mr. Abbott. I'll be right there." Nicholas Abbott was barely beyond earshot when Patsy whispered hoarsely, "Your fiancé? Are you really engaged?" "Not on your life," Abby murmured, standing and squaring her shoulders. That's pretty bad. Then she took a deep breath. "And I intend to tell him as much right now," she began boldly, only to be interrupted by Patsy's droll reminder. "You mean you'll have Grace tell him as much?" Uh-oh. Well, yes. I mean, he knows we're not engaged, and he'll have to realize that declaring himself my fiancé won't get him through any more directly." Patsy rose to walk beside her. "Go get him, Abby," she drawled when they reached the lobby. Abby frowned and mumbled a low, "And here I thought I'd be free of all this." "Just break up with him. You should have broken up with him a while ago, honey." "Clearly." As she spotted Grace in the office behind the desk, replacing the receiver from a call just completed. Then, her anger momentarily suspended, she watched Ben Wyeth nod his thanks to the court officer and head her way. So I guess he was on a call. His brow arched roguishly. Whatever that means. "Fiancé," he taunted her in that soft drawl of his, and she knew he was about to add another clue to the puzzle. But before she could correct the misconception, he had nodded in salute and passed her on his way to the front door. She watched him helplessly, not quite sure why she felt so bothered, finally blaming it all on Sean as she took her turn with Grace. I mean, yeah. The guy you don't really like just proclaimed himself your fiancé because he's annoyed that he won't have access to you for 3 weeks. So I think we can pretty solidly blame it on Sean. When she emerged, there was no sign of Ben, either on the front porch, where she'd assumed he'd been headed, or in the living room, where a handful of the others were sitting. Somehow she couldn't face joining them. With a sigh of defeat, she retreated to her room. An hour later, she sat propped against the headboard of the king-sized bed, wondering what to do with herself. Had she been at home, she would have read or listened to music, perhaps reviewed some notes for the following day's work. Now her mind was on the following day, but its focus was a very different kind of work. It was only natural to be apprehensive, she told herself. After all, everything was so new, and Sean hadn't helped things with his argumentativeness. Whew! Even Grace had begun to despair toward the end of the call, after she'd explained the rules to him several more times. It wasn't that he couldn't understand them, simply that he wouldn't accept them. He sucks. But that was his problem, Abby mused. It is, shifting her feet to the floor and standing. She paced slowly to the window, then turned, finally sinking back into the cushioned armchair nearby. From the minute she'd seen this room, she'd liked it. Tucked up on the third and highest floor of the house, it had the same charm as the rest of the inn, perhaps even more with its dormer windows and tiny alcoves. Even now, as her eye wandered from bed to wall to dresser and rug, she felt totally at home and comfortable. How had the others fared? She wondered idly. Did they too have handcrafted quilts on their beds, regional artwork on their walls, fresh flowers in the vases on their small sitting tables? I sure hope so. Otherwise, I gotta be worried about Nicholas Abbott being a creep. This room was a palette of lavender, blue, and white. Were the others the same? Probably not. Against her better judgment, her mind wandered to Ben. Where was he now? Had the rooms been assigned in order of arrival? In which case, he might be next door? She listened for any sound that might come from either of the adjacent rooms. Nothing. Perhaps her neighbors hadn't come up yet. More probably, she decided with a frown, they were in bed. What about him? Maybe the innkeeper put you in this secluded room so that he could murder you in private. Just a thought. With a soft exclamation, she jumped up and crossed the room to the nightstand by the bed. Within seconds, she had the front desk on the phone. Yes, the jurors were to be woken at 7. Oh, she wanted to run earlier. No, that was no problem. Ray would be going out at 6. Was that all right with her? Fine, then. She'd get her wake-up call at 10 before the hour. Was there anything else she wanted? A warm drink? An extra blanket? No? Well, good night, then. When, after an hour of dropping notes to her family to tell them of her whereabouts... How? Like placing calls or literally writing notes? I don't know. Abby finally fell asleep. Her mind was filled with a myriad of thought fragments, not the least disturbing of which were one about Benjamin Wyeth, the caste system in India, and a nagging sense of something she'd forgotten. Really not looking forward to learning how the caste system in India fits into this story. It might not be horrible. Maybe. Okay. That was it. The J. Benjamin J. Wyeth. I'm still vaguely holding out that he's like Sean's old buddy. We'll see. Dredged from her memory bank, it came to her the instant she awoke to 3 short rings of her phone. Benjamin J. Wyeth. It had to have been over a year now since his book had come out. Oh, he's a publisher. He's an author. There we go. She recalled Andre mentioning it one Saturday as he'd placed copies of it on the shelf. I think Andre is a bookstore owner, a local bookstore owner. She hadn't seen it again, but then she hadn't looked. What was it on? Not India. China, perhaps? Oh boy. The question helped to keep her awake as she threw on her running suit, laced up her sneakers, and headed downstairs, wool hat in hand. Cute. Halfway down the last flight, her foot wavered, then continued more slowly. "Morning," she said softly, testing a smile. It was a poor facsimile of the one she might have produced had it been 2 hours later. Usually she ran alone, with no one to witness her slow awakening. It was small solace that the others seemed as groggy. Ray nodded silently, as did the juror named Brian. It was the final member of the running team, though, on whom Abby's attention stuck. Of course. "All set?" he asked, his hair boyishly mussed and more sandy-hued in the morning's pale light. "All set," she breathed, and fell into step with the men as they moved toward the door. Ray, the court officer come runner, seemed most concerned with the female he had on his hands. Really? "You run often, Miss Barnes?" "It's Abby, and yes, every morning." They were on the front steps and descending. "Good. Why don't you and Brian move on ahead? I'll take up the rear with Ben." Given her choice, Abby might have arranged things differently. She certainly hadn't expected to find Ben running, though in hindsight she should have suspected as much. That was difficult. He was too broad in the shoulder and too narrow in the hip to lead an active life. And since he'd been the first thought in her mind when she'd awoken that morning, this unexpected rendezvous might have been a boon. But then, she reasoned by way of consolation, she wasn't much up for talking yet. Yeah, as mentioned previously, I am not a runner, When I do run, I certainly cannot have a conversation while it's happening. The sun had barely edged over the horizon, and she still had her own waking up to do. Okay, we have like 5 pages left. We can do it. Tugging the wool cap in place to ward off the morning's nip, she indulged in her usual stretching exercises before straightening to find all 3 men watching her. Creeps! Dudes! Is something wrong? She asked, suddenly self-conscious as she looked from one face to the other. But her look turned to one of challenge when she recognized the male appreciation in their regard. Gross. Don't ogle the juror. Don't you all limber up? Not quite that way, Ben dared to reply, his hands on his hips, his eyes twinkling. Please die. Ray wasn't as bold. Let's go, he mumbled, waving Brian off. Abby continued to stare at Ben for a final moment's censure before turning and starting out. You know the way? She asked Brian, who nodded curtly. Did it yesterday, was all he said. His eyes were on the path ahead, his concentration fully on his running. Brian is the only man who has rights in this book, so far. Never mind, he was also watching her creepily. I hate them. Following his lead, Abby immersed herself in her own thoughts as she ran, much as she did every other morning. She found her pace and kept it, breathing evenly, pleased to find that with her lighter weight and more petite frame, she kept stride with Brian easily. If these 3 thought they'd leave her behind, she reflected in amusement, they'd be in for a surprise. That very element of pride gave added bounce to her step. The inn fell from sight as they wound through the trees on a path that seemed tailor-made for their purpose. Maybe it was. Abby quickly saw the truth to Grace's claim that the jury's accommodations were ideal for recreation. Here there was no fear of contamination from the public. Not once did she catch sight or sound of civilization. Are there bears in Vermont? There was only the rhythmic slap of running shoe against pavement, the occasional sound of breathing. I mean, I think you're breathing the whole time. Doesn't matter. And most delightfully, the morning sounds of the woodlands on either side. Confident of her ability to run a 6-minute mile! Jesus. Abby used her watch as a measure of distance. Brian kept several paces ahead, seeming to know just which way to take at a crossroads, leading them in a general figure-8 pattern that was nearly the mile itself. The sky grew lighter with the birth of the day just as Abby grew increasingly awake and aware of what that day would bring. One part of her would have been very happy to burrow in a mossy nook in the forest and then rejoin the runners at the same point tomorrow. But that was the coward speaking, she chided, knowing that her better part was filled with a subtle excitement. And then, of course, there was the knowledge of Benjamin Wyeth pacing himself a distance behind. As the mile count rose from 3 to 4, then to 5, she grew increasingly distracted by that thought. Pride kept her from looking back. Indeed, from the competitive angle, she was pleased to stay ahead. If only he weren't looking at her all the time. As though summoned by her thoughts, Ben moved forward. Not bad for a girl, he quipped. Please die. Falling into stride beside her. Abby caught her breath and looked sharply up, prepared for battle. But his smile was so sincere that her flare of indignation fizzled. He sucks, babe. Contriving a frown, she simply shook her head in exasperation. If the truth were known, her usual limit was the rapidly approaching 6-mile point. It occurred to her that she might soon be out of her league. Best she should concentrate on holding her pace steady. But Ben's concentration was more inclusive. Does your fiancé ever run with you? He asked with nonchalance. So much for steadiness, she mused as her pulse raced faster. Had that been on his mind all night? Or was it an innocent question? A quick glance at his expression failed to enlighten her. Nope. They ran a little further. You told me there was no one. She waited until they'd crested a small rise. There isn't. Had she looked at him then, she might have seen him nod at the logic of it all. What? She had to wait somewhat longer for his verbal response. What's a fiancé? With a will to revenge the disquieting fact that he'd had free scrutiny of her for the past 40 minutes, Abby ran on some before answering. In this case, she spoke between breaths, it's a man who insists on making a pest of himself. Ah, he saw the light. Simultaneously, the inn loomed ahead. The runners slowed gradually before reaching the front steps, each seeking his own walk around, letting his legs readjust to a more natural pace. Coming to a full stop at last, Abby grasped the sturdy wood railing and stood for a minute to catch her breath. Then she pulled the wool cap from her head, thrust both hands through her damp hair to comb it back over her shoulders, and sat down to cool off before going inside. Ben promptly slid down against the opposite railing and watched as first Brian, then Ray excused themselves and disappeared. Then he straightened one leg, bent the other at the knee, and leaned back. This is his super casual stance. You're not engaged, he stated, looking at her askance. I do like the word askance. Nope. Angling forward at the waist, she grasped her calves and carefully flexed the sensitive muscles of her lower back. My back hurts, I'm hunched. Her face was buried against her knees so that she was unaware of movement until she felt a pair of hands on her back unhand her. Then she jumped in alarm. No, he gently pushed her down again. Stop it! Hold still. Let me see if I can do something about that stiffness. How did you know it was stiff? That's what she said. He asked, but her voice was muffled against her running suit. That little move a second ago, you stretched pretty gingerly. Homing in on precisely the spot, his thumbs began a circular kneading that brought a helpless moan of relief from Abby. Feel better? Does it ever? She exhaled slowly. Does your back always bother you when you run? Uh-huh. Oh, I'm sorry. Only when I stop. Very funny. Abby might have laughed had it not been for her growing awareness of his fingers. Not only those thumbs that pressed and rubbed, but the others, 4 on each side, that seemed to round her middle and stake their claim. My problem with romance books is that I think possessiveness as like a romantic trait that people look for is bad. There was nothing laughable about their strength, nor about their exquisite gentleness, and her eyes were no longer shut, but rather wide open. Eyes wide open. Eyes wide shut. Is that the movie? Don't watch it. It's really bad. Suddenly, Ben leaned forward. I think that's about as much as I can take, he mused on a husky note. Blech. When she turned her head instinctively, she found his within inches, and his message couldn't have been more clearly broadcast than it was in the smooth quicksilver of his eyes, the manly lure of his mouth, the absolute earthiness about him. He smells like dirt. So attractive. Abby's heart pounded loudly with her acknowledgement that Ben Wyeth was not only good-looking and companionable, he has manhandled you without your permission, ogled you when you were stretching, and said you ran well for a girl. Throw the whole man out. But the sexiest man she'd seen in years, blah, blah, blah. She felt the animal magnetism that radiated from him, felt it in the tingling response of her body. Ooh, frisky. They straightened slowly as a pair, neither breaking the silent spell. She took in his rumpled hair, his sweaty brow, the night shadow of his beard, and felt all the more attracted. Then her gaze fell to his lips, and she watched them move. That's how people talk, usually, unless he's just moving his lips for fun. "We'd better go in," he murmured. She nodded mutely, but couldn't budge. "Abby." Eyes widened, she met his gaze, knowing only that she wanted him to kiss her. But his tone had been of warning, and he clamped his mouth shut, daring only to stroke her cheek with the back of his hand before pushing himself to his feet. I don't think I've ever had someone stroke my cheek with the back of their hand before. Am I missing out? Is that what romance is really all about? Then he cleared his throat. "I think we ought to get showered and dressed," he said, offering her a hand up. "I thought you stood up already." They straightened slowly as a pair. "So you're already standing up. Okay, whatever." "They say breakfast is set for 7:45. We're supposed to be at the courthouse an hour after that." Where better judgment hadn't had a chance, mention of the courthouse brought her to her senses. The trial! She'd nearly forgotten why she was here, why he was here. Because of his earthiness and animal magnetism. With a soft moan of self-reproach and an apprehensive wince, she walked head down through the door he held and moved distractedly toward the stairs. The trial, beginning in just about 2 hours. Are we going to get actual, trial stuff? Or is this just a romance in a jury house? Her stomach fluttered in a totally different way than it had moments before. As she headed up to the first flight, she wondered what it would be like to sit there in the courtroom and not only watch the proceedings, but be a vital participant in them. It was only when she'd reached the landing of the second floor that she realized Ben was still beside her. I'll see you at breakfast," she half whispered, then turned to mount the flight to the third floor. Her footsteps were echoed the entire way. "So he is on your floor." At the top, it was Ben's turn. "See you later," he murmured, waiting for her to turn left to his right. When she turned right as well, he stood stock still and watched her go. Her hand was on her doorknob before she looked back at him. When she frowned and tipped her head in puzzlement, he advanced. He stopped no more than an arm's length away. An arm's length from Abby's, an arm's length from his own door. Suddenly his expression warmed with that same humor she'd found so appealing from the start. "This may prove to be as much of a trial as the other," he drawled, staring at her a minute longer before letting himself in and shutting the door. Abby knew exactly what he meant. I don't know, you guys. It sounds like it's going to be pretty easy to get into bed with each other. I mean, connect on an emotional and mental level. Okay, well, that was chapter 2. It's not getting any better. Did I think it would? Not really. Really not looking forward to learning what the caste system in India has to do with any of this. But I guess we'll find out. Or maybe I'll give up on this and never do it again. There's always a chance. Well, thank you for joining me for chapter 2 of An Irresistible Impulse. And maybe I'll talk to you again soon. Maybe I'll do chapter 3. Maybe.